Hello again, Harry Powell for Severe MMA, and I am joined by the brand new XFC middleweight champion, Mr. Fergus Jenkins. Fergus, how's it going? Yes, show them.
Good,
Show
bro.
them,
Good,
Fergus.
good. Thanks for having me again, mate.
Absolutely. Absolutely. How have you been, my friend? How have you been?
Yeah, really good. Just just training for the next one over in Australia. But it's definitely been a long process now, especially seeing that last XFC camp was drawn out, like a 12-week camp. So I'm just getting used to the process of that long drawn out training process. But it'll all be worth it when I get the fights over in Oz.
So let's talk. I think there's three talking points there, and we'll go through them quickly. Obviously, you won the XFC title against Jonas Grace. Do you want we had a chat about that offline before the fight? Do you want to talk a little bit about what your expectations were of Jonas going in, whether those expectations were met actually in the fight, and sort of how you felt in the fight?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, going in, and I could I think I had a pretty good read on him. Like I could tell he was going to be a really tricky opponent. Like he had a few tricks up his sleeve. Quite a unique stylistic matchup. I suppose that's to be expected when you've got such a unique physical frame for the division, like a 6'5", 6'6" sort of middleweight. Like that's a rare breed. So obviously there's going to be something a little bit different in their style. And I could tell, like, yeah, watching the tape and then feeling it inside the cage, like he had a bit of a unique style, especially on the feet there. And even the way he used his frame on the cage really well and set up the chokes and everything. So yeah, and I knew that stuff before the fight, and I prepared well for it, and I felt like that allowed me to sort of counteract that in the fight. And I followed the game plan that we laid out, which was obviously based on watching the footage, and that all worked perfectly in the fight. So yeah, I think we had a good read on him. There wasn't necessarily too much I didn't expect. I had to sort of adjust my range a bit in the first round because I found myself sort of in that middle ground where I wasn't all the way in or all the way out, and I was sort of hanging in the balance and got caught a couple of times by the front kick, which was something I was able to avoid later on, just by being aware of that. But yeah, I basically in the fight, even though I talked so much about how I wanted the finish, I did kind of take the easiest path to victory, the one with the least path of resistance, because it just seemed, why risk it when I can just go straight for the double leg, where I felt like I had it was such a dominant area for me. So just keep going back to where my bread and butter, where I'm able to dominate the fight easily.
Okay. So forget all the other questions. We'll get back to those later. Let's talk about exactly that. So you've just mentioned, I wanted to finish. I was talking about that I wanted to finish, but
Yeah.
instead in the cage, I took the path of least resistance. As a fighter who's obviously extremely young in their career, but is building sort of plethora of experience at amateur, what do finishes mean to you? Do you feel pressure to get finishes, or do you feel pressure to win? Like, what is it, you as an athlete, you as a person, what is it that you find is more important to you?
Um, I'd say, like, especially based on what I chose to do in that scenario, that's probably proof that to me winning is more important. Like, winning's the ultimate goal. But it definitely did mean something to me to try and get not a finish with the submission, because I got plenty of those, but get a finish with the hands. Um, which I think I had a lot of success with. I think I hurt him quite a bit on the feet. Like, definitely, he was feeling the shots, but yeah, obviously not quite enough to put him away. But yeah, I mean, I suppose my decision to take the path of least resistance and just go for the wrestling route is proof enough that, yeah, winning's the main goal for me, which I think is probably a healthy way of looking at things.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm going to chuck in. I was going to leave this until a little bit later, but there's a podcast that we run on Severe MMA called Speaker's Corner, and essentially it's a discussion about a variety of topics that are not pertaining to stuff that happens necessarily in the cage. Like, it's not like, oh, Anthony Pettis is fighting Stevie Ray this weekend, what do you think about it, or whatever. And the topic that came up last week was damage, right? And you mentioned there, oh, I know I hurt him a number of times on the feet, but just not enough to put him away. I know that we've sort of had this conversation previously, but I think now, after you've had a couple more performances and you've obviously been in training camp for longer and et cetera, I wanted to get your opinion on damage now, both you inflicting damage on somebody and potentially taking years away from their life and career, but also damage that you're taking both in training camps and in fights. How do you feel and how do you reconcile with that process and with that knowledge?
Yeah, it's something I definitely think about, like especially damage to the brain. Yeah, all sorts of damage, and it's something I noticed. Like even just taking a few shots in my last fight against Jonas, like it was only really the first round where he clipped me with a few shots, but he got. I had a couple of cuts, one above my eye, one on my chin, and that's just from like. It's not like I took a lot of shots in the fight, so yeah. Imagine like an all-out brawl, like you see, especially in the featherweight division of the UFC recently, just like some crazy beatdowns, and yeah, imagine how they must feel the next day. Like obviously that's something to keep in the back of your head. So yeah, it's something I'm cognizant of. Like it's obviously a huge, like a real and present danger in the sport. And in terms of dishing out damage to other people, yeah, it's definitely not the reason I do the sport. Like it's something I'm obviously all right with. Like I'm not I don't have too much pity for my opponent, obviously, or I wouldn't be able to go out there and lay it on people. But I think I definitely don't go out there with the intention of hurting people. I go out there with the intention of competing, and that's, I guess, an unfortunate side effect of the sport that we do.
Right, and this is something, you've just given me the same line that you gave me last time, right? Which is, I don't go out there to
Yeah,
really hurt my opponent. I go out there to compete and to essentially to win, right? That's obviously the end goal, and we've discussed that just now with your performance against Jonas. I think the thing that I would like to ask, and maybe this is a difficult question for you to answer, but because you're sort of the new era, the new breed of the sport, it feels as though there's been a transition. As always, there is with generations, right? Things change, mindsets change, society changes with the new generation. It feels as though MMA has begun to take a change, has begun to make a transition. And that transition is there are more athletes competing in MMA now, viewing it as a sport, than there are, like if you say you take Chuck Liddell's era, right, where they were fighters looking to fight,
yeah.
right? Do you feel that is a view that you hold, and you find that you're alone in holding that, or do you find that more of your peers are seeing the sport that way?
I definitely think like that's especially from casual fans, like that they look at it a lot more as a sport. Like it just the way it's produced, the UFC, it's a lot more clean cut than it probably was in the past. And yeah, I think there has been a big shift in perception. And I think like to speak to that, I think it's very different when you go and watch it live for the first time compared to when you watch on the TV. So you watch on the TV and yeah, it just seems like a sport. It's quite hard to connect with the reality of what you're actually watching and how violent and brutal it is. But then when you're actually there watching it live for the first time, it's such a different experience. It's obviously a lot more visceral, and you can see the impact of what's happening right before your eyes, um, like in reality. And I think that probably shocks a lot of people. And I guess it can go two ways. It can make you love the sport more and make it feel more real and give you that I guess that bloodlust, like you just love to watch the violence unfold, and that will make you appreciate it more. Or it might go the other way. Maybe some people will be put off by the brutal reality of the sport, but I think that would probably be a good litmus test for a lot of fans, would be to actually watch a live fight, and that would probably that would give them a more realistic view of what the sport actually is.
Yeah, and on that point, you mentioned there, like, if people had a realistic view of what was happening, right? Something that I think would also help, and I think this speaks to what you were talking about earlier, is if fans were able to see day to day what athletes go through preparing for a fight, right? You mentioned at the start of this interview that, I had a really long drawn out camp for Jonas. I'm going now into a camp for the Oceanic Championships, and we'll get onto that in a little while. Do you think, first of all, I'd like to, if you're happy to talk about it, I'd like you to go into a little bit more detail of what a long drawn out camp really means and what it actually looks like.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think from my perspective, if fans had an understanding of what it means to go through a 12, 14, 16 week camp, maybe a fight gets pulled, then you get a new fight, it's 4 weeks later than originally planned, you're still in camp, you're still dieting, you're still training hard. Like, what does that actually mean? What does it look like?
Yeah, it looks like routine, basically. Like, if you look at the fight, like from the fans' perspective, they see the big, exciting action at the end, the finished product of all the work. That just consists of a long, drawn-out process, which is just about following a routine and following a process that gets you to the finished product. So for me, that involves diet, obviously, just eating clean, eating, I guess, relatively boring. I actually had I was filming like a day in the life type video with my mate who's Orion, who's a photographer, and yeah, so he was filming, and just he was in awe, or just couldn't believe how boring my diet was, just in terms of like flavoring. Just to me, it's just like bare bones food. Like, I just try and get what I need. It's the food that I'm eating. It's to fuel my training. It's not necessarily to taste good or whatever. I don't mind it. I actually enjoy what I eat. But yeah, from like a general perspective, it's not the most exciting, flavoursome food.
Well, give us an example. What, obviously, first of all, when does the video come out and where can we find it? And then secondly, what does a day in the life of food consist of for you?
I filmed it yesterday, so it's very early stages of editing. So yeah, I don't know what will come out. I think what he was particularly shocked by was me eating plain chicken with no salt or pepper or any seasoning or anything. Yeah, but it's just stuff like that. As I mentioned before, breakfast was porridge oats. So it's nothing too exciting. Yeah, and then so besides the diet, obviously training is a huge part of it. And to me, yeah, more and more I'm realizing it's a balance. Like, you've got to train hard, but it's not as simple as just training hard. You have to constantly be making sure that you're not overdoing it. You're giving your body enough recovery time, which is sometimes the hardest part for someone that just wants to push and do as well as they can and get themselves in the best shape, because it'd be easy for you to just go and push it as hard as you can. But realistically, you've got to constantly monitor yourself and realize when you need to pull it back, which can be the hardest. Sitting around and doing nothing can be the hardest part when you're motivated and you want to do your best. And that's something else you realize with balance. It's constantly changing, so you're having to constantly tweak the recipe that you use. So even with diet, like, it's important to sometimes spice it up and have something that you want to eat, not just something boring. Because
like salt.
Yeah, salt. Yeah. Maybe not as far as sugar, but
Sure.
no. Yeah, just something that spices things up, and because obviously you can't just constantly be in the same routine. Yeah, so it's just a huge amount about routine. So between training, diet, recovery methods, whatever that might consist of, sleep's the main thing. Just making sure you get the optimal amount of sleep, because I mean that's probably where you're getting the most bang for your buck in terms of recovery. So if you can, if I'd say it's about sleep, diet, and training, and it's a boring process, I guess. If it's not something you love, then it'd be very hard to stick to.
And I'm going to try and wrap this up into a slightly different question. You're still a very young man, right? Still very, very early in your life, let alone in your career. The endeavor that you've decided to embark upon at this point in your life, you've just detailed three things that force you to be very regimented for very long periods of time. The way that you closed your last sentence was, if you don't love it, you can't stick to it, right? It's very, very difficult to stick to it. How do you balance still being a kid, essentially, right? A young man who wants to go and hang out with his friends and maybe do the parties and do this and do that.
Yeah.
How do you balance that with also having a life as like a pretty high level athlete, right? How do you still do that? How do you maintain that childhood nature?
Good question. Yeah, like I kind of don't realize how unique some of the things I do, like the way I eat and like just my lifestyle is, until I like talk to other people, and they're just like, "What? You live like that?" And I'm like, "Yeah." To me, it just seems normal. But no, I have no issues. Like, I mean, obviously, I don't do much drinking or any of that stuff, especially when I'm in training camp, which I have been for like it feels like my life at this point. Like that's all I've been doing. Um, but usually, yeah, I set like there's a big distinction between out of camp and in camp. But I haven't really had much out of camp since before Abu Dhabi. I was training for that um, all the way before Christmas last year. So yeah, the balance has definitely been swayed more towards the training side of things. But I got plenty of close friends that we can hang out and do things that don't involve drinking or anything like that. So I don't have too many issues with that. I can sort of hit the balance where I can have the social life, and I can do yeah, all I need to do to prepare for my fights. But I suppose something I'm thinking about going forward is just trying to like make the sort of bridge the gap between training camp and out of camp, because I don't think the two should be too different. Like I think it's maybe like some of the processes I do in terms of the regimented lifestyle, I could probably relax that a little bit in camp, but also not go like too Paddy Pimblett mode outside of camp and just go crazy on the food. Like I think probably finding a balance between the two and just creating like more of a healthy lifestyle year round is probably the best approach without going from one extreme to the other. Yeah, so I think that's probably the biggest thing I want to start implementing.
Yeah, I mean, that's on the periphery. That's something that we spoke about last time that was in your thoughts, right? And I think it's a smart thing to do. You touched on Paddy Pimblett there. What are your thoughts of that sort of method? I mean, he's somebody that he owns the way that he lives, right? He documents how heavy he gets in between camps, and he's been on record saying he'd prefer to be fat and happy than skinny and miserable. What's your take on that sort of behavior? I mean, clearly you don't take that same approach, but what's your opinion of that sort of behavior?
Um, well, I guess at the end of the day, he's got the free will to choose to live his life how he wants it. So if that's what makes him happy, then you can't really argue. But definitely from a performance perspective, if you're just thinking about being the best fighter you can be, it seems like it's not the best approach. I mean, there's probably some pros. Like it's probably a good way to switch off and give the mind a rest, just giving yourself that downtime. But ideally, you can get that downtime without having to go too crazy on the food. But I mean, it's working for him so far. But I suppose the real test is longevity. and seeing if you can sustain a high level of athletic performance over the long haul with something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's a very sensible approach, right? I want to switch it up slightly to, you mentioned that the Oceanic Championships are coming up in next weekend, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
You mentioned that you've essentially been in a training camp for what feels like 7 months
4
at
months.
this point.
Yeah,
4 months, right?
probably more. Yeah, if you count the COVID break, 4 months. But
Right.
yeah.
So we've talked a little bit about what training camp means, right? And obviously you've been talking about the regimented style for that. Can you talk a little bit about what you expect from the Oceanic Championships, and for people that maybe aren't aware of what that means, can you talk a little bit about the structure of that and what you expect from that championship?
I'm expecting kind of a mini version of what I did in Abu Dhabi. So that was 5 fights over 6 days. This will be 2 fights over 2 days. So I'll get there Friday, fight Saturday and Sunday. Yeah, obviously a much smaller division, only four participants in this one compared to 32 in Abu Dhabi. But I'm expecting a relatively similar process, but on a much smaller scale. But even 2 fights in a week is exciting because that's more than one fight in a week, which would be the norm back home in New Zealand. So yeah, and
And
I'm really
what
excited
things?
to be
Oh, sorry,
fighting
go on.
overseas as well. Again, I've never fought in Australia, so it's a long time coming. Obviously, with COVID and all that, it's been difficult to get those opportunities to fight abroad. And yeah, it'll be cool to fight it overseas again for the second time after Abu Dhabi.
What things have you been focusing on in your training camp based on the performance in Abu Dhabi, based on the performance against Jonas? What are the things that you focused on, not necessarily in preparation for the championships, but just generally to bring yourself to a higher level? What are the things that you've been focusing on in the last little while?
Uh, One big thing is just trying to keep it simple. Trying not to download too much information and suffer from paralysis by analysis. I think a little bit for that fight, I was spending a bit too much time like researching, thinking about new techniques, and trying to learn more without giving it enough, without dedicating enough specific time to those individual techniques to actually ingrain them into the muscle memory to where they're actually going to be useful in a live fighting scenario. So I suppose for me, it's about, especially just when it gets close, that couple of weeks before the fight, just really narrowing down on what I think, what works for me and what's the most high percentage techniques for my game. Narrowing down on those, making sure that they're well drilled enough to be muscle memory. Um, I think that's something I did pretty well before the Abu Dhabi, the championship over there. Just really working on those reactive takedowns, things like that, other weapons in my game. And now I've focused on that even more. Got a couple of other elements that I've drilled out well, and I feel like just having that commitment to drilling those techniques into my muscle memory is probably the biggest thing that I've been thinking about.
On that, I wanted to throw maybe slightly a curveball question in, but there's been a lot of conversation in the last little while in the MMA community about judging, right? About the scoring criteria and how fights are judged and scored. As an athlete, do you think about the scoring criteria when you're training? Do you try to build a game plan that's going to bring you success in terms of the scoring criteria? Or if not, one, why not? And two, how is it that you structure your game plan, if that makes sense?
Yeah. I guess I wouldn't think about it in a detailed way. I wouldn't go down and read the criteria and then base my game off that. But I suppose in a general sense, I I would sort of like the sort of basic stuff. So like it's obvious. Like if you get a takedown and you pin the guy down the whole round and land some shots, you've won the round. So I suppose I think about it in that sense where it's more of a feel. But I suppose to your point, that sort of doesn't guarantee you anything, because there are some little specific loopholes in the judging criteria where you might feel as though you've won the round, but actually by the criteria where I suppose it emphasizes damage the most. I don't know if that's the same for amateur. You might not have won the round where you feel you did. So that's probably something I could put more emphasis on. Yeah, to your point. So yeah, the answer is no, really.
And I think that's interesting. And the reason I think that's interesting is because if you were to be an outside party listening to the answers that you're giving to these conversational points, you're a very cerebral person. You're clearly an intelligent person. I mean, we talked about, your level of academic qualification in the last one. It feels as though that seems to be just like a general whole in training in athletes. Is yes, you're absolutely right that the scoring criteria, especially in professional MMA, I agree with you. I don't know what amateur MMA is. I'd have to look it up, but I suspect it's the same. But the primary scoring mechanism is damage, right? It's action that's leading to the finish of the fight, whether that be you lock up a really deep rear naked choke and maybe that guy manages to survive, or maybe you have a really hyperextended armbar and the guy manages to survive, whatever it is. But if we sort of take it to your style, well, the way to win rounds for your style isn't just to take somebody to the ground and control them, it's to damage them whilst on the ground, right? Because to your point, the nuance in the rules is if you take a guy down, let's say in your last fight against Jonas, if you took Jonas down and held him for 2 minutes and 50 seconds of the round, but he's landing all the damage from the bottom, well, he wins that round, right?
Yeah.
So to your point, if you're taking a guy down and you're like, well, I'm winning because I'm dominating him positionally, but he's landing, 15 shots to your nothing, and then the decision goes against you. Now, I'm not saying, this in an extreme egregious way, but I find it interesting that you're building a camp or building a style without having the criteria baked into that style. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's interesting to see if judges actually do bridge the gap between theory and practice in that situation. Like, how often do we see that actually happen? Like, even though maybe by the judging criteria, the way it's written, judges should be scoring the fight to the guy on bottom, what do we see 90% of the time? I feel like it tends to happen to where the judges score the fight for the guy on top, even if the guy on bottom is outlanding them, like from my experience watching the footage. So maybe there's a difference between how judges actually scoring it in reality and the way it's written in the rules. So that, I guess, that makes it difficult for athletes to put much stock into how it's written if they feel like the judges are just sort of using their own instincts and rather than actually necessarily looking at the specific rules, like the way the rules are written out.
Yeah, I mean, I think my opinion is that at the highest levels, the judging is pretty good, to be honest.
Okay. Yeah.
I think the only thing that I have seen in the last little while was Damon Jackson fought Dan Argueta in maybe 2 or 3 events ago in the UFC. And Damon Jackson had Dan Argueta's back for, 3.5 minutes, 4 minutes of the round, a really significant period of time, but landed, no offense from the back and equally didn't threaten any chokes. He was just maintaining back control. And Dan Argueta landed a number of shots that started to swell Damon Jackson's eye up, which was, very visible damage. Now, Damon Jackson ended up winning that fight. And I think that's the only time in the last little while that I have seen a situation similar to that. Obviously, if you're in a grappling tournament, Damon Jackson is 100% winning that match, right? He's significantly up on points. In a grappling match, as obviously MMA is not a grappling match, but in an MMA fight, the judges did not score for what I thought was clearly outlanding from a damage perspective, because positional dominance means much less in terms of damage. So I would agree with you that there are rare occasions at the highest level, maybe at lower levels because judges aren't of the same qualified level, they maybe haven't had the same experience, etc. But I think I would argue at the highest levels of MMA, generally the judging in those sorts of situations and generally judging across the board is pretty solid. But
What do you
I
reckon about
completely go on.
last weekend's main event? Because I feel like Gamrot appeared to have won that fight off the wrestling towards the latter stage of the fight, but he wasn't necessarily accumulating a lot of damage or dealing out a lot of damage, but he did take a lot from the kicks and from the punches
Right.
on the feet.
So I certainly scored that fight. Now, let me preface this. There is a man that works for Sir MMA named Sean Sheehan, and he is brilliant with scoring criteria and judging. I am not that man. I am not very good at judging. I am definitely not that thing. But watching and analyzing the scoring criteria and trying to put them together, I scored that fight for Arman Tsarukyan. I thought rounds 1 and 2 were pretty clear for Arman.
Yeah.
I thought he landed the far superior damage, and the grappling exchanges were pretty neutral, right? As you say, there were loads of scrambles, loads of beautiful scrambles, but not a lot of damage done in those scrambles, right? I thought 3, 4, and 5 were close. Really, really close. The thing that you mentioned this earlier, right? You can watch through your TV and it's one thing, but when you're actually there ringside, the shots can take on a different form, right? There are things that we could be missing.
And when you're actually the fighters, they probably, in some ways, they have the best idea of who won because they can really feel the blows and they know who's dealing more damage and who's having more success.
Right. And we don't know whether the shots, I mean, we can say, as I said, I scored the fight 48-47 or 48-46. I'm not very good at maths for Arman Tsarukyan. I thought he won 4 out of 5 rounds. But again, I could see, thank you. I could happily see Gamrot winning 3-2. Easily, no problem. Those last 3 rounds were very, very, very close. And like you say, we don't know those shots that Gamrot were landing. Arman Tsarukyan could have just had a brilliant poker face and such an iron neck that his neck wasn't snapping back, but they were dealing significant damage. You're very right in saying the real guys who had a good awareness of what damage was being landed are the 2 guys in the middle, right? But I think when it comes to close fights, I find it very difficult to blame the judges because close fights in MMA are going to happen regardless, right? If you're in a close fight and in the heat of the moment, you're going to think, I won that, I did enough. But if you can go back to your corner after 3 or 5 rounds of fighting and say, Jesus, this is a close fight, I find that it's difficult to say, oh, well, it's the judge's fault, right? Close fights are close fights. And I think that, this is where maybe the wins and losses in MMA, the reason why wins and losses mean slightly less in MMA is because there is, such thing as an incredibly close fight. But I think on the whole, judging is in a far better place now than it ever has been. I just think that there's way more speculation on what judging is right now. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. Well, and I think inherently it is subjective. Like, I don't think there's anything wrong with people having different scorecards for that fight. I think that makes sense because, as you say, there's so many swing rounds that could go either way. But it also brings up an interesting point, like how much, like if you score that fight as a whole, I'd say just about everyone would probably give that to Arman. Because you look at the first 2 rounds, clear rounds for Arman Tsarukyan, I think most people would agree. And you look at the last 3 rounds, could go either way, could go to either person. So two dominant rounds versus 3 very close rounds, you'd still probably sway towards the 2 dominant, but they're not quite dominant enough to be a 10-8. So
yes, I mean,
whole,
yeah.
And there's a few fights like that. Like I would say Max Holloway, Volkanovsky too. I feel like that could go either way, scoring round by round. But if you scored the fight as a whole, I'd say virtually everyone would give it to Holloway. So yeah, I think there's a few examples where that does play a factor.
Right, and I think your points are very valid. And I'm not saying that the judging criteria, or sorry, the 10-point must system or round by round scoring is the best way. I think it's the best way we have right now, because it allows for the criteria to be processed and applied in a very logical manner. And I think the last thing I'll say, when you said things are up for sort of up for interpretation, in some fashion, yes. I mean, I do think the judging criteria could be slightly clearer in its language. There are some things that I think leave a little bit of grey areas. For anyone that's watching this that hasn't, Sean Sheehan has a fantastic couple of YouTube videos sort of dissecting the judging criteria and dissecting the language in it. And for anyone that hasn't gone and watch it, go and watch it. But I think the other thing that plays a big factor is position on the night, right? The three judges sit in three different positions.
That's huge. Yeah.
That is absolutely massive, because if Gamrot is over the other side of the cage and the crowd's going wild behind one judge, they might not hear the shot land, whereas somebody on the other side might hear it very literally, and it could be a big shot. But because maybe the cage wire is in the way of a certain thing, or maybe they're moving in a certain direction, or one fighter has their back to the judge and they don't see the shot specifically. And I know that some of the really prominent judges, they'll stand up and they'll slightly move around the cage so they can have a better view. But, we're talking about humans with all of their flaws judging other humans, right? Like that's inherently it's a difficult thing to do.
Yeah, and it's never going to be perfect, I don't think. And going back to the round by round versus scoring as a whole, I tend to agree. It would be a big task, like looking at a whole fight without breaking it down into bite-sized pieces and saying this is how it scored. So I think the round by round system is probably better because it allows you to break it down into a more digestible scoring system. And
right, if I said to you, okay, Fergus, I want you to go back, sit in front of Soryukin and Gamrot, and not write anything for 25 minutes, and then tell me who wins at the end. You're going to forget what happened in the first 5 minutes. It's impossible, right?
Yeah.
So I think I agree with you. But I'm really interested to hear somebody like yourselves' opinion on these things, given that you bring new ideas to the sport. You're somebody that's been in the sport for a short amount of time in comparison to, let's say, a Gamrot or a Soryukin or, any of these guys that have been in, 15, 20 years. So I think it's important that you voice these opinions, and I think it's important that you have your say.
Yeah, and it's probably something I need to think more about and spend more time mulling over. But even just like a first impression is probably quite useful because it's less likely to just blend in with what everyone else thinks already. Like when you hear someone's opinion when they haven't necessarily listened to all the different viewpoints, you probably get something fresh.
I agree. I'm going to spin this on its head drastically, and I'm going to ask maybe a slightly controversial question, and then I'm going to get your opinion on Israel and Cannonier. So the question I'm going to ask that's slightly controversial is, coming out of the IMMAFs, it feels to me as though you have become the poster boy for Anzac MMA. Maybe whether you believe that, whether you think that's true from an amateur level or not. Is that something that's crossed your mind? And if it has, how do you feel about that sort of stature?
A little bit. Like in terms of like the photos and everything, I seem to be pretty prominent on those. On like the photos that IMMAF posts up or whatever it is. But I wouldn't say it really phases me too much. Like, I think kind of surprisingly, because I went from someone that didn't really have any of that exposure whatsoever to, like, I suppose, as you say, potentially a poster boy. But it doesn't really affect the way that I think or my day-to-day life in any way. So I'm happy to get that exposure if that's the case, but I'm not really too phased.
You're a smart man. Let me get your thoughts before I leave you. Give me your thoughts on Israel Adesanya versus Cannonier first. How do you think that fight goes?
I think Izzy's got this one in the bag, to be honest. I hope Cannonier really comes to scrap and really tries to get Israel out of there, because I think that will make for the most exciting fight, and it will probably end up with Cannonier playing into Israel's hands, and I think that will allow Israel to secure an exciting, dominant performance and probably a finish if Cannonier really tries to get after it. And at the same time, if Cannonier doesn't try to get after it, I think he probably has less of a chance to lose, but he also has less of a chance to get finished. More of a chance to lose, sorry, but less of a chance to get a finish. Less chance to get finished. So he'll almost guarantee himself a loss, but he might not get finished in the process. So I think it depends on how Cannonier approaches it primarily. I think
Okay.
it's smart enough to where he'll fight his fight no matter what Cannonier does.
I think I agree with that assessment. And do you have any thoughts about Volkanovsky Holloway?
Yeah, I'm really excited about that one. I think it'll be super cool to see how that one pans out. And I'd favour Volkanovski as well. Might be the Anzac bias, but I just think he's been on fire recently. I honestly, in my opinion, he's the pound for pound best fighter in the world. I'd put him above Usman. Yeah,
Why?
I just think he's cleaner. Like, I think he's got everything, and he's just the way he. Yeah, I just think his striking is cleaner. His striking is cleaner than Usman's, and I don't think the wrestling. Obviously, I would say Usman has a slightly better wrestling game, but in terms of how that actually applies itself in the cage, like I don't think it's something in these championship fights that Usman's really been using. So I don't think it initially makes a huge difference to who's the better overall fighter if Usman's slightly better at wrestling. But I think Volkanovski's striking dominance is his technical level of striking is higher than Usman's, and I think that makes more of a difference.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Well, look, as always, I will thank you a huge amount for your time. If people haven't already, please tell them where they can watch you this upcoming weekend. Tell them where they can find you on social media. Let the people know what you've got going on in your life.
Yeah, man. I assume it's on IMMAF TV for this upcoming next fight next weekend, and yeah, stay tuned on my Instagram and stuff in terms of any updates and that day in the life video coming out, which should be in the pipeline. So yeah, lots of exciting content.
Beautiful. Well, thank you very much for your time, sir. It's been a pleasure as always.
Thanks so much, man. Cheers.